Our gospel for this week comes to us from the book of Mark, the 10th chapter. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to him, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated, except, of course, for the kids, because I would like to invite the children forward. Have a seat up here. If we've got any scouts who might want to come forward, because I'd like to hear from them in particular. There's just a lot of stuff up here that we don't usually have on a Sunday, and I need some people who can explain it all to me. And that, I am going to need some helpers, some scout helpers. First and foremost, I want to know about these flags. Right, Thomas? We love flags. Can somebody tell me what's this flag here? What are the banners? I see Camp Away Champion Games. You won some games in '91. Some of you might have been scouts at that point in time. It feels like it's 30 years ago now. But what do we got? Anyone tell me what are these flags for? Like legitimately, I don't know, and I need somebody. Yeah, Ethan. Okay. Okay. Cool. Okay. So we got PAC 79, and is this one going to say Troop 79? What's the difference?
PAC is Cub Scouts, Troop is Boy Scouts.
Good. And we got one each, right? Do we have boys and girls? All together, right? That's pretty awesome too. Okay. What about the uniforms that you guys have on? What sort of things are on there? Those are cool. Sweet. Did you guys make pumpkin patches? I'm seriously finding out about this for the first time. That's awesome. Oh my gosh. And can we say, yes, a big... So, like, legitimately cannot do the pumpkins without you guys, and we are so thankful every year when you guys show up, not once but twice to unload. That is so cool. Yes, Ethan. I see you've taken on the tan. Are you a Weeblo? Okay. Oh, cool. Okay. Now, so Weebelos are getting this pumpkin thing. Are the scouts doing any sort of badges for the pumpkin? I'm going to encourage you to develop a pumpkin patch. Get it? You know? Well, hey, listen, I want to thank you guys for being here, for bringing these things, for explaining us, and just for everything you do here. It is super helpful. Beckett, last thing, and then we're going to be singing our song. Beckett, go ahead. Hold on. Wait a second, Beck. I knew it, and you guys just got back from camping, as a matter of fact, too, so very appropriate for a Scout Sunday. Thank you guys again. Let's sing our song now. Ready? If anybody asks you who I am, who I am, who I am. If anybody asks you who I am, Would you join with me in prayer? O Lord, may the meditations of my heart and the words of my mouth be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. It's no joke. So the priest comes in on Sunday morning, and he works his way up to the altar, but before getting there, before even reaching this stage, he prostrates himself and he gets on the ground and he says, "Oh, Lord, I am not worthy. I'm a worm. I'm the worst. I neglected all my duties. I'm a real loser." And then he gets up and goes and sits down. And the bishop follows him. The bishop gets down a little closer and he puts himself on the ground and he says, I'm even worse. I'm just a sinner. I'm worthless and I despicable. And then he gets up and he goes and he sits there. And then at the back of the church, the janitor comes and puts himself on the ground out of sight of everybody and says, "I am also worthless. I have derelict my duties. I have not done what has been asked of me. I've sinned in my heart and with my body and soul." And the bishop goes to the priest at the altar and goes, "Get a load out of who thinks he's worthless." Even when we're doing our best to try to embody humility, humans have this jujitsu ability to turn it into something self-aggrandizing. We're going to speak this morning about reverence, about humility, about kindness, and in many ways I feel like I'm listing out the Scout Code and the values that Scouting purports to be about, and I think that there's some overlap there that's on purpose. So I went on Indigenous Peoples Day, because we had the day off of school, we went to the Boston Children's Museum with our kids, with Thomas and Ellie, and fascinating experience. If you've never been there before, it's a really cool museum. It's a Boston Children's Museum. What I was doing my museum viewing on was the other parents. That was the interesting exhibit for me. There was this one section where I was with watching Jackson and Thomas, the older kids, and Karen, her sister, were with the little ones. But they wanted this to be in the construction zone, where they had tower cranes that went up, and they had all these vehicles that would go over bridges and down below. And I figured out for the first time actually what this exhibit was about. It was about the Big Dig. It was actually supposed to be about teaching parents who'd probably driven in through bridges and tunnels and traffic and all these issues, like, oh yeah, that's how this whole thing happened. But I was watching the parents watch the kids, and I thought, what a fascinating thing that we even have something called a children's museum. The concept of this is just fascinating in its own right, that we think that we should dedicate what is a lot of resources towards the building of this facility for children. I thought to myself, if you were to roll back 100 years and ask a random person in the Seaport District where this is located, ask your random dock worker down there, say, did you know that you're standing on the future site of the Children's Museum? You know what they would probably say to you? That's terrible. Children belong with their parents, not in a museum on display. And then they'd probably follow up by saying, or secondarily, they belong in a chimney somewhere, bringing home a paycheck. But clearly there's been some development in the series of how we think about people, little people who are the least of in our society, people who don't have accolades, don't have accomplishments, don't have much money. Nevertheless, we think that an investment in them at the scale of a museum institution is something worthwhile and something we should do. Something is shaping our values. And I would guess, in fact, I'm very confident, that those values are values that have come from our faith. And they have been passed on to our culture in a good and positive way. I like that. So let's take a look at one of those places where it comes from in our gospel here. The last shall be first and the first shall be last. We should literally build a museum for people who are last on our list of importance in the world. We should elevate those. If you are just picking up the scriptures today and just have heard these things for the first time, perhaps because, I don't know, the last couple weeks you were selling popcorn, or maybe you were in the woods somewhere, maybe you were putting scout sticks together in our basement over a fire, a thermal vent activity. I saw it downstairs. Anyway, if you haven't been paying attention, you need to follow up on where we've been in Scripture the last couple weeks. This is a continuation of a story that Jesus has been sort of building. The first thing is that several weeks ago, we had Jesus with a child. This is probably the reason why I'm thinking about the Children's Museum. He's got a child on his lap. He says, "Let the children come to me, be like children, accept the gospel like children." This is part of a whole thing about humility, about how do we see ourselves and how do we receive God with humility and with honesty about how God's the one who is doing the elevating, not us, and not the accolades that culture hands out. If you haven't been paying attention last week to the scriptures, maybe because you were barking or you had the zoomies at midnight and your owner is telling you to be quiet and just lay there and you're not allowed on the sofa, bad dog, right? If you were doing that instead of paying attention last week you would have heard this story about some of our disciples sort of doing what we heard this week, trying to figure out their place. In fact, Jesus is saying to somebody, hey, unless you leave everything for me, unless you leave your possessions behind, your family, if you don't put me absolutely first, then you've got competition in your hearts for me. And Peter says back to him, hey, we've left everybody behind. Your disciples, the people who are following you right now, have done exactly that commitment that you're asking. And I say that because James and John's assertion today that they deserve to have a left hand and a right hand place at the table, this honoring thing, it's not coming out of nowhere. It's too easy for us to point at those guys and say, oh, what a bunch of doofuses. They clearly don't get Christianity. No, Jesus literally was praising just last week the commitment of his disciples and saying, good, I appreciate you for doing that. You are on the right path. But something goes astray. Clearly what James and John are asking for here is Jesus says it's not like that. It's not like that. The Gentiles may look at power as something to be accumulated and lord over other people. This is a pattern that we see quite often. For you, you're going to have a different set of values, what we call in church oftentimes kingdom values, values that come from Christ. Now, we try to live those out. We try to be reverent about those values and really enshrine them. And we like it when they get passed on to our culture. But there is a little bit of a danger to it. One of the dangers is things like a children's museum. When we oftentimes see church decline happen, and when we see cultures in which where we see church attendance drop, it tends to be in ones that actually do the best job of taking care of their citizens. And in many ways, it's because church gets replaced. We lose our relevancy when other institutions take on care for the needy, when they look after children, when they do the work that and live out the values that I believe are born out of our institutions. So high trust, high investment societies like that include places like Norway. And Norway is a Lutheran hub. And Norway's church attendance is crap. They do not have a lot of people in church. And when you ask most people about, like, well, why don't you give to church? Why don't you attend church? They will largely say, I don't know if I need to. Everything that I believe is important in my society is handled by my taxes, right? So there is this question of irrelevancy. And in most other times, in most other years, maybe even in most other months that aren't so close to November, I would say that is very much on display. However, it feels like when elections are nearby, that's when I see our social fabric and our trust fray the most. And the things and the values that we live out the rest of the year or the rest of the months, which seem really solid and certain, the solidness with which we would say that the poor need to be taken care of, that we consider your other Americans to be your brother and not your enemy. Those things, they fray a lot come November, and it doesn't feel good. It feels very much like we are eroding things that should be solid. And I believe that one of the reasons for that is we have lost our reverence and replaced it with irrelevance. And we need to reclaim both of them. I believe that if we actually do a deep dive, if we actually look deep into ourselves and ask us, why do we care so much about children? Why do we care so much about taking care of those who have a hard time taking care of themselves? Why is it that we continue to invest in and care for people who might have mental illness or people who have been hurt and are unable to work for themselves? Why do we do those things? Because God modeled it for us, because God passed down to us that care. And what I think is important about that is that it's robust. You can't easily walk away from a commandment from God. Those are things that are true commitments, and they don't fray. And I've seen this many, many times. I look at the institutions whose commitment never wavers, and the places that don't walk away from an important mission like that. And they tend to be places that have reverence, that have faith at their core. It helps us to articulate why it is that we value these things and to keep it sacred. Now, the way in which this church in particular lives out that commitment is that we have a holy meal every week. And I'm going to invite you, if you're comfortable with it, to join in that holy meal. It's a meal that reminds me of what Jesus said to James and John of, hey, can you drink the cup that I drink? Can you be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? At that meal, I say some words, and I'll say it again. I say this is a meal that everybody's invited to. We form a ring around this altar. No matter who you are or where you've been, you're invited to it. And it is a meal that has open access. It's given to all people. And it's also formative. What we do at that table is we drink something, and we're told that God is going to be present, and we eat something, and we're told that God is going to be present. Our Catholic brothers and sisters, they seem to have the specifics of how that happens in God's presence, and we just say, we know that he said he'll be there. I don't know what's going on in the theology of it. We just know that he said he's going to be there. And when we are formed, therefore, into a community by our communion, it's a community of Christ. What's important about that is that the cup we drink is the cup of a guy who is 24 hours away from having the most humbling day of his life, having the worst day probably of his life. And we eat the same kind of bread that he ate right before he made a sacrifice for all of us that was so grand and so solid that for the centuries afterwards, we knew what it is we had to do because of what he did for us. As you come up to that table or as you witness what happens there, I want this to be a day in which you think about that and think about what is our value and what is the guiding principles with which we must conduct ourselves, because we cannot count on our culture just to feed them back to us. We must fight for what is right, and we must stand up for what it is and learn about what God tells us to do, and punctuate it, please, always, by knowing that this thing is something that God has made for us and done for us completely. As first we were once loved, we must now go and show that love to the world. Amen.